told you that?
You.
I did. Oh my God. You realize you're talking to a dinosaur, aren't you? I mean, when I was in school, when I was roughly your ages, we were making handmade ink drawings on Mylar, and we made these basswood models that you see by hand. There are no laser cutters. So, to ask me about social media, someone who really doesn't use social media, and it was a conscious choice. I mean, I use email, and I have a LinkedIn, you know, sort of book face, a site, and but other than that, I don't use social media to interact. I get lots of social media coming through my computer. I'm conflicted about social media, and this is an indirect way of answering your question, but I think that social media is so far ahead of where we understand what it is about and what it's doing to us as a society, how it's impacting us culturally, not to mention politically and all these other things that you're hearing about now. For me, the jury is out on social media and its effectiveness in all domains, including architectural production. That's not to say that I think it's a bad thing. I just think that typically, particularly in the 20th century, technology has raced ahead of our ability to understand the impact that technology is having on us. In design, I mean, what I sense, you know, in terms of how it impacts architectural production is that it provides a connectivity that was never possible before. We can communicate in real time with anybody in any part of the world at any moment that we want to. I mean, I Skyped this morning with some colleagues in Florence, you know. 20 years ago, less than maybe 20 years ago, I couldn't have done that. So we're able to, in one sense, be on top of events as they are changing and occurring, whether it's political events or whether it's the design of a project that's moving forward. And you have several entities that are working on that project in different locations, engineers, designers, the contractor, the client, and so forth. You know, clearly these technologies have aspects of them that are incredibly useful and represent an enormous potential in terms of our ability to, you know, to sort of create a new physical environment out of all this. How it's having an impact, I'm not entirely sure. I think there are pros and cons with all of that. The case in point, I think, on the positive side, a few months ago I was in Boston and I met with the Office of Ensemble that is lecturing next week, specifically with Deborah Mesa. And she described to me their practice, which is in 2 countries, in 2 continents. They practice in Boston and they have an office in Madrid. The main office is in Madrid. She spends most of her time in Boston, and her partner and husband travels back and forth to Madrid a lot, managing that office. They've set up lines of communication at various times during the day because of the time differential, so that it's all completely fluid. And so when a project is being worked on in Madrid, the drawings for that are sent, you know, easily, quickly, instantly to Boston. She can interact into those drawings and send them back to Madrid. This is not the future, this is the now. And when you see that, you know, in the context of my own experience of practicing in those early years versus what practice is now, it's pretty stunning to me. I mean, I think of what I could have done if I had those tools available to me. So I think there are benefits, and I'm guessing that there are some liabilities in here, and that we're going to be spending the next few decades trying to sort of suss all of that out and suppress the liabilities and accentuate the benefits. I discovered Pinterest a few years ago, and it was one of those aha moments, you know, one of those revelations to say, well, this is a brilliant idea. Now, if you surf the Pinterest site at all, you see that there's a lot of fluff in there too. People who post all of their favorite pictures of cats and so forth. You know. So it serves that population, but in professional and academic terms, it's an incredible tool. And I realized right away that my interest in facades could be supported through an archive of images that would be referential for me. Whenever I need a quick image for a lecture or for a publication, I can go to those places and find something that meets exactly the need that I have. But early on, I also realized that it was an incredible teaching tool too, that it was an archive that I could create, that I could tailor to my own specific interest and my own particular teaching style, that in my interaction with students, it becomes very easy then to say, listen, you should look at X, and you can find it on my Pinterest site. And then what I've discovered since then is that there is a lot of interest in that site, not just from students here at Syracuse, but I get, sort of people sampling from the site from all over the world all the time. And so it spurred me on to keep maintaining the site and adding additional folders to, as I found new sort of slices of typologies, to sort of include in there. And right now I think I've got something like 10,000 images. When I see that number, I think, how many hours have I been spending downloading, those images? But it's addictive at a certain point because, again, here now I have access to this world of images instantaneously. There's an archive out there on the web of just about anything that I'm looking for in the way of a particular facade. And then when I find those things that I think are particularly relevant or of a certain quality, then I will load them onto the site. So it was easy to do that. I once a week I would probably spend about an hour just building the folder. And for a few years now, I think I had the Pinterest account when you were my students, right?
It was 3 years ago.
And so, then I realized that there was a real teaching tool here that I never had before. So, and now I'm on the verge of retirement. Just as I build this incredible, I'm leaving teaching. So what was I thinking? No comparison. There was no comparison between. I started practicing in 1975, so I don't want to, how many years, how many hundred years ago was that? And it was, mechanical pencils and a lot of time interacting with the clients and preparing documents and drawings that they could understand, which means perspectives and physical models and so forth. And it was enormously time consuming. I mean, what you can do now with a Rhino, with Rhino software, and how you can put the client into that is amazing. I don't know if you ever watch these HGTV shows, Flip and Flop and those others that are on there. There's that Texas couple in Waco, Texas. They take old houses and they fix them up. Well, when she meets with the clients, she's using this three-dimensional virtual reality software where her clients can go right in and see what it's going to be like when it's done. And then the finished product often is very close to that. That's enormously powerful. So if you're asking, if the question is about how one practices, we are worlds away from what it was. I mean, the opportunities that we have now for representation of ideas is extraordinary, and you all know that we're on the cusp of really taking a deep dive into virtual reality such that you can walk through your project before it gets built. And that I find enormously exciting. There's a film opening this weekend called Ready Player One. Do you know about this? Yeah, it was based on a book that I read a few years ago that's really kind of interesting. Spielberg has made the movie. That represents, I think, in some ways, where all of this is kind of going. The downside, and I'm getting off track here a little bit, but the downside is that I can imagine us just sort of disappearing into virtual reality, because you can create any world that you want. All you need to do is be sure that you have an IV in your arm so that you don't have to eat, just. But in terms of practice, it's I practiced here in Syracuse, in Pittsburgh for a number of years, and then I moved to Syracuse and to teach, but also to practice. But I found practicing here was really difficult, simply because there was not much in the way of resources locally, money that people had available to do whatever, houses or restaurants or lawyers' offices or housing. And where there was money, there wasn't a lot of cultivation. This is a little bit of an indictment of Syracuse, but it's a small city and it's limited in how willing, the population is to accept ideas, even if they're not radical ideas. And so, Art McDonald and I did Possibilities Restaurant. When that was done 30 some odd years ago, I think, 25, 30 years ago, that was a big deal. The architecture, they thought, and everyone that came, they thought it was a big deal. The point simply being is that with social media today and with all the tools that we have at communication, it's much easier to market yourself outside of the region and get projects that are much further afield, and to interact with your client much more easily, your distant client, the remote client, much more easily than it was then. Then we had to get in a car and drive somewhere to talk to somebody and hope that we get the project. And so a lot of time was spent, chasing after work, and not a lot of time was available to actually do the projects, because we're constantly trying to market ourselves. So it's easier now, I think, to do that. So you could be located in upstate New York somewhere, but also have, a regional or national or even an international practice. I had lunch with the visiting critic, Karim Masawar, yesterday, and I asked him about his practice, and it's pretty remarkable what he's able to do, based in Beirut, but also find projects around the Middle East. I think it's an indication of, the world that you're going out into that is going to be enormously exciting, and I think the opportunities are going to be so wonderful for you. I don't feel anything about that. It doesn't interest me, frankly. It's, a kind of phenomenon, a social, cultural phenomenon, and you can put a lot of stock in it, I suppose, and say, well, these are the guys that are sort of running the profession. They're the ones that sort of lead the way. But I think actually that's not true. Number one, I think it's much more of a media-driven kind of thing. If you go below the surface of all of that, sort of media attention that's given to the starchitects, you find that there are some really great designers that are doing really interesting things out there that don't have the same kind of visibility or celebrity, but they are as equal to any of the starchitects in terms of their talent, and in some cases I would say better. I think someone like Gary or Rem and the others serve a certain kind of purpose in terms of moving the culture of architecture forward and making it available to the broader public. I mean, I think the greatest challenge facing all architects is educating their clients. That's probably job number one that you have before you do anything, is to educate your client. And I think they help make architecture interesting to a broader population. But it's offices like shop architects that interest me more. Now, they have a certain kind of celebrity, but I think what they're doing in terms of developing the agency of architects to actually do what they do best is much more important in terms of the future of architecture than what maybe Rand or Frank Gehry does. I mean, shop has an extraordinary marketing machine that they have deployed. They also have a branch that does construction, so they're a design build firm, and then they're doing research at the same time. There's a branch in the office, part of the office that is focused on research, materials research, construction research, and they have figured out how to give architects much more agency than architects typically have. And so those are the firms that I would look to rather than the starchitects, I think, to see what the future of architecture is going to be. Architecture and life. There's not one person that I think sort of made all the difference in the world to me. There were a series of people along the way. I consider myself extraordinarily fortunate in my career and my life, in that in many instances, I just sort of found myself in the presence of somebody who at the time I wasn't aware of it, but in hindsight I realized what a difference they made in my life. And a lot of it was by accident. Some of it by design, but a lot of it by accident. I think there was one person at the Cooper Union when I was a student going to night school there. It's a long story, but for a number of years I was going to night school because I couldn't afford to go to day school. So I went to Pratt Institute for a while, and then I heard about this school called the Cooper Union that if you got in it was tuition free. I said, well, that's where I have to go. And I applied, but it was too late for daytime admissions, so I did get accepted to night school. And then at night school I met the director of the evening programs, and he took me under his wing, and a year later I got admitted into the day program and started all over as a freshman. I was a freshman for 4 years in a row before I finally got into a professional degree program. And while I was at Cooper, I met John Haydock, and John Haydock made an enormous difference in my life. And I met Robert Slutsky, who was also my teacher when I was there, and he changed the way I saw things, particularly through painting. In other words, the analogy and the relationship between painting and architecture. And then I met Eisman when I was there, and I think that probably the person who had the greatest impact upon me was Peter Eisman. He was my teacher at the Cooper Union, and then when I graduated, he offered me a position at his office, which was the only position that he had. I was the only person. It was a one-man office, one man plus me. And those 2 years of working with Eisman, and then those 2 years of being an intern at the Institute, changed me all over again. So there were these cycles of transformation in terms of sensibility, in terms of cultural orientation, in terms of what architecture was really about. Because prior to that, my ambition, was to be the general manager of some architectural office and have a nice income and be able to afford a nice car and so forth. And after going through these guys, they changed everything for me. At a certain point, when I left Eisman's employ, he said, you should teach for a while, try that for a while. And that's how I got into teaching. I started at Carnegie Mellon University, and then 3 years later, I ended up here. Well, that's an interesting question. There are so many interesting places that one could have a program. I think Latin America is on a cusp right now. I mean, there's always the economic and political situation of those countries that holds things back, but I think Latin America is beginning to come into the fore. Certainly China and India, you know, are incredibly hot places in terms of cultural development and opportunity, I think, not only to understand the traditional culture, but to understand what's happening now in China and what's happening now in India. My interests actually right now are in Africa. You know, a place that has had a terrible history of colonialism and then strife and civil wars and terrible things that have happened across Africa, but the potential in Africa is enormous. And you know this, you would know this because if you look at what China is doing in Africa, they are very interested in Africa and they are pouring an enormous amount of money into infrastructure and into agreements to extract minerals out of Africa. They know where the opportunity is. We have our head in the sand when it comes to Africa, at least in the current administration we do. But I would love to see a program in Africa, and one that works, that is very different from the London and New York and the Florence program, which are essentially urban-oriented programs. 3 different kinds of cities and 3 different kinds of experiences that you can have in understanding a traditional environment like Florence, a more modern city like New York, and then a city like London that is a combination or maybe a collision between the modern and the traditional. You know, that is, that London is trying to work out, negotiate that relationship. So those are 3 very different cities, and when you go there to really immerse yourself in those kinds of urban environments. Africa is not so much about the cities as it is about the country and the land, and what can be done to help, you know, those dispossessed and disenfranchised populations in basic needs like schools and health clinics and so forth. And some of the most interesting architecture that's being produced right now are modest projects in Africa. You know, our own faculty member, Yutaka Sho, has been working in Rwanda for a number of years, and she was the one that got me interested in Africa and what she was doing in Africa, which led me to look into the work of other architects. I don't know that you were here when this happened. It was a few years ago. Do you remember the 2 Rwandan students that were here?
Yes.
You do, yeah. There's a long story about how they came over, but it was because of Yutaka Sho and her connections in Rwanda that we were able to identify 2 young men who were able to take a year off from their architecture program in Kigali and then come here for a year. That made all the difference in the world to them. They are now practicing architects in Rwanda. They've traveled to Germany, back to the United States for conferences and for leadership programs. What it demonstrated to me is that you can make a big difference with a modest, you know, kind of investment. Invest in a couple of young people, send them back to their country, and, you know, see what happens. And wonderful things are happening. I think that model could be applied to, you know, on a larger scale, so that we, for instance, Syracuse has a relationship with the Kigali Institute of Architecture, and that we have some kind of exchange program, and that it would allow our students to go out into the field to build, to design and build, do a design-build program, design and build clinics and classrooms and community centers that are desperately needed in these small towns, you know, outside of the major population areas. So like, that's a long-winded answer to your question, but I would say Africa. Everybody's in China, a lot of people are in India, there are programs in South America. How many programs are there in Africa? Architecture programs. So. about favorite cities, which is a misnomer. You can't say favorite and love. It has to be, favorite implies one, I suppose. Well, look, Florence is my second home. You know, I've been going there to teach and to live since 1980. And I have friends all over. I married an Italian-American woman. She has relatives already. So when we go back, it's like coming back home. And so Florence is a kind of home to us. So it is a very favorite city. I know Florence very well, and when I go back there, I have to go back to my favorite restaurant or my favorite olive oil dealer, you know, my favorite shoe store, you know. And so I would say, you know, definitely Florence, but I lived in Boston for a while. As an American city, it's probably my favorite American city because it's the most European American city. And there's just a scale and quality and character and relationship to the water that Boston has that I think is particularly appealing to me. So if I were going to settle somewhere in the United States other than in Syracuse, it would be Boston. I'm from New York City, you know, and there's a part of me that is still there. I still sort of think when you're out of New York, you're out of town, you know, that old chauvinist, New York chauvinist sort of belief. But so there's a part of me that always wants to go back to New York. But you know what? I love Syracuse. When I came here kicking and screaming because it was Syracuse. What the hell? There are cows, you know, on your front yard. I mean, what? But after living here for 40 years, I've become completely convinced about the kind of quality of life that you can have in upstate New York that you can't have in many other parts of the country. It's affordable. In 10 or 15 minutes, you get in your car and you're in deep countryside. You know, in 2 hours, you can be in a French-speaking province of Canada. You know, if you draw a 5 or 6 hour circle, you know, drive in a car around Syracuse, it takes in Toronto, Buffalo, Albany, Boston, New York, Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, and so forth. And so, at this point in my life, I'm happy to sort of keep this as a kind of base for me. The air is clean, the water is clean, there are no, I mean, I'm from New York, I've driven on Long Island Expressway, you know, with the world's largest parking lot. I don't ever want to have to deal with any of that, you know, kind of environmental oppression that you get, that you have to accept when you live in a big city. This is a great place to live. It's a great place to raise kids. I'm a skier, so I got lots of skiing opportunity. I like good wine, so I go to the Finger Lakes if I want to sample some good wine. So I'm a cheerleader for Syracuse. And so maybe the long, you know, the answer to your question is, out of all of those cities, Syracuse is my favorite place right now. I think it has a future. Things are happening here. As soon as they take down 81, things are going to begin to happen. So. Who told you that?
You.
I did. Oh my God. So I'm out. You outed me
Yeah.
here. You know?
Can remember
All right. You want to know the truth?
Yes.
Can you handle the truth? Here's the truth. I'm a child of the Second World War. I was born in 1944, believe it or not. My father was based, he was in the military, and he was in charge of the German prison. During the Second World War, when they captured German officers or Italian officers, they would take them out of Europe, so there was no chance that they could ever get back into action. So we had prisoner of war camps in the United States for German and Italian officers. And he was in charge of the prisoners of war up at Camp Drum. So in fact, the first year of my life was spent in upstate New York. I'm from New York City, but he was based up there. And then he was discharged in 1945, and we moved to Astoria, Queens, back to Astoria, Queens. And I grew up at a time when parents would open the front door at 8 in the morning and kick you out and say, be sure to be back for lunch, and then kick you out again and say, be sure to be back for dinner if I wasn't in school. So I grew up with freedom, you know, to sort of explore the environment in ways that you would never imagine parents doing that today. And so I was very adventurous about that. In 1950, my father got a GI mortgage, and we moved out to Nassau County on Long Island into a little Cape Cod bungalow that wasn't much bigger than this room here. And during the 50s, that neighborhood that I lived in started to grow. When we originally got there, at the end of our street was a stream and a woods, a forest, and so forth. And so for the first several years, I had this sort of this bucolic environment that I was growing up on. But nearby, houses were under construction. And I was fascinated by that. So after the workmen left at the end of the day, my buddies and I, the Forest Street Gang was what we called ourselves. It was Forest Street. So we were the Forest Street Gang. We would go a couple of streets over and climb on these houses like they were monkey bars. I mean, you know, when I think about what we did and how we could have killed ourselves several times, you know, I blanch a little bit, but we would do that. And then we got this idea, so well, what if we take some of the scrap wood and build our own houses or forts, tree houses and so forth. So we started by taking, you know, small pieces of wood that we could manage, and then we realized as we were building these tree houses in the nearby woods that we needed bigger lumber to do that. So we, you know, went back and started taking 2x4 by 8s, you know, and bring them home and store them in the backyard until we needed it. My mother would say, where did you get this lumber? She says, oh, it's scrap that those guys over at the projects are throwing out. We're just collecting it off the scrap pile. And she would say, okay. So we continued to build a project, and one day there's a knock at the door, and it's the job foreman from the project over there. He traced the missing lumber back to us, and that was the end of my tree house.
Did you have to return the wood?
Well, we had cut it up, you know. He simply said that if your son continues to take the wood, we're going to sue and you're going to have to pay for all that lumber. So that was the end of my career as a contractor, you know.
That's funny that you call them tree houses, because our next question is why bird houses? So do you think that could have influenced it a little bit?
Well, yes, in the broader historical sense. I've always been a maker, a builder. There is something about the handling of material and the working of the material, whether it's wood or metal or anything, that always appealed to me. It's just the tactile aspect of it, and I think it goes back to my childhood. I love the smell of wood, the texture of it. I like that you can take a piece of wood and turn it into something beautiful or interesting or useful. And so all of my life I had been doing construction of some kind. And my father was very handy. He was a very good carpenter, and he taught me carpentry. And after I graduated from high school, when I was going to night school and working for an architect during the day, I needed some additional money. So on weekends I'd work as a carpenter. And then when I moved to New York, I continued to work as a carpenter and make additional money to help pay the bills. And so there was this long history of a kind of craft sensibility and craft interest that I always felt. And Cooper Union at the time, and still to this day, that is, I mean, certainly under Haydock, he really advocated for a kind of craft sensibility, so that one of the first projects that you had as a student at the Cooper Union was to build the pieces and the parts of the model that you were going to make for the 9-square analysis project that you get. So you would start by making the pieces and parts for the model, and then you would build the model once you designed the project. And he insisted, on a precision and a kind of quality of finish to the material that was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. And I've always carried that forward in my own work. I've carried it forward in my teaching all these days. These days, trying to get students to build physical models is like taking out wisdom teeth without anesthesia. It just makes me a little crazy. If you go to my studio right now, there's a giant model of bird library, and they're supposed to be developing facades for it. That model has been sitting there with no study models attached to it for about 8 weeks now. So I'm ready to throw them all out the window, I think. The thing about the birdhouses is that my wife and I have a house up north, a summer house that we've been building together for 30 years now. By hand, we've been building this house. And it's about 95% complete. It's that last 5% that's going to take another 30 years probably to finish. But what I have is a workshop that I built for myself up there. And so during the summers, as part of a kind of a program of physical therapy, it's the antidote to all of this. We walk on the beach up there just to exercise, and then I bring a backpack and collect driftwood. And I've been doing that for years, and you find really interesting things that wash up on the beach. And so about 8 or 10 years ago, I don't know what inspired me, but I decided I wanted to make a birdhouse. We live on a wooded site with lots of different birds, and so I thought I'd make a birdhouse for the birds. And this crazy thing came out of it. I don't know what I was thinking, but it was just a wild, it wasn't, a Wrightian birdhouse. Well, you saw the one that was in the show, so that was one of the early ones that I did. That wasn't the first one, but it was one of the early ones. And at the end of it, the reaction on people who saw it was always surprising to me. They really loved it. They said, "This is fantastic." So I did another one, and I did another one. Then I started giving them away as gifts. I gave Julia Zerniak one for a birthday present and so forth. And the response that I get from people who do that is great. So I continue to do that as a hobby. I have no interest in trying to monetize it. My brother-in-law, who lives out in California, who's a money manager, financial manager, took a look at some of these things. He says, "You could make a fortune with these things. Send one out to me in California, and I'll sell it for you. You could make $500, $600, $800 with this birdhouse." And I said, "Well, first of all, how the hell would I package that damn thing? The box would be about this big. And I have no interest in sort of trying to monetize it. He wants me to set up a website." And I said, no. So it grew out of my natural interest in construction and building and fabricating and so forth. And my interest in the circumstantial way in which I collect the material. It's just nature delivers it to me on the beach, and there it is. And I said, well, what can I do with this? How can I put this odd thing together with that odd thing? And so then it becomes an architectural exercise. Thus the name of my company, which is Architecture for the Birds. So, I don't have a company. I just Ooh, that's an interesting question. A lot of things. I was always interested in the natural world, and so biology, I always did well in biology and environmentalism and so forth. And I mentioned to you that I grew up around the countryside, and so I would bring home all sorts of animals that I would capture. So I had, terrariums with snakes and mice, and I found a bat sleeping one day, so I caught it in a big mayonnaise jar and brought her home and put it in the parakeet cage. It killed the parakeet, and then because Bats don't have bones, they have cartilage. You know, their body is made out of cartilage. So it slipped between the bars. My mother comes home and this thing is flying around the house. So I always was interested in nature, and so I think if I didn't become an architect, I'd go into biology. But I have a pilot's license that I've had for 50 some odd years, and but I don't think, well, I got drafted out of school in the 70s during the Vietnam War, and I wasn't interested in being given a gun and put out in the jungle somewhere. So I applied to Naval Flight School, and I got almost to the point where they were going to enlist me, and then they asked me that $64 question. They said, how do you feel about dropping bombs on people in Vietnam? I said, well, maybe I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. I said, sorry, we can't use you. I had always fantasized about taking the pilot's license and converting it into something more advanced, you know, like flying jets or being a commercial pilot. But I realized that once I take something that I love to do as a hobby and I turn it into a job, that I probably wouldn't enjoy it anymore. It becomes routine and so forth. And so I continue to fly privately and have no ambitions to do that. Although I toyed with the idea, particularly when, you know, the opportunity presented itself to get my hands on an F-4 Phantom or one of those multi-million-dollar planes that the military has. I think one of the things I'm going to do in retirement is go down to Florida, where you can actually, for a certain amount of money, you can fly a jet or you can fly a P-51. You know what a P-51 is? Here's a P-51. It's probably one of the most successful planes from the Second World War. You can fly one of those. So I'm going to go down to Florida next year and get my hands on a P-51, make a low pass up 300 miles an hour. Well, I think that's a really interesting question. And a difficult one, because I've had a lot of good advice over the years because I needed it. You know, I was always rambunctious as a kid, and that rambunctiousness carried over into school and into my professional life and so forth. So, who gave me? Well, it was Eisenman, and it was in my thesis semester, and I will never forget this. I was struggling with thesis because I was resisting. It wasn't that I was having trouble designing. The problem was that I was having difficulty accepting the regimen that I was being subjected to by the school. At Cooper Union at the time, your thesis had to be a house. Everybody did a house for thesis. And there was a good reason for doing that. I mean, the program of the house, of any house, is well known. You don't really have to think too much about the program of the house, because it's something that you've lived all your life. And the intent there was to disconnect the emphasis from program to the formal elaboration of the project through design. And because there's no house that you can't live in, meaning that people live in all kinds of houses, and so it would be hard, I think, to make a house that someone couldn't live in. And so the intention of the project was to liberate the design of the student from the, let's say, the constraints of program, and even from the constraints necessarily of construction and so forth, and let your imagination run wild in building a house. And this, you know, on the surface of it, it sounds great. But everybody had to do a house. And I didn't want to do a house. I wanted to do something else, you know, something more radical than a house. And so I struggled with it, and I was resisting it. So one day, you know, I complained to Peter about this. He says, come on with me. So we go across the street from Cooper Union and down 7th Street is a bar called McSorley's. You know McSorley's? It's the oldest tavern, the oldest beer house in New York City, and it was right next door. I used to go to McSorley's all the time with the guys. Women were not allowed. It was strictly a male bar. I was there when it got busted by women. They came in and they stood their ground. There was only one John, and it was a male John, you know, urinal, and women came in and shared the John with guys. You know. So it was a big event when the women busted that place. But before that happened, it was still a male-only tavern, and Eisman took me in. We're surrounded by guys drinking beer, eating cheese and onions and crackers. And so I sort of complained to Peter, said, I don't want to, do this. John is making me do this. I want to do my own. And so he leaned into me and he said, kid, just cartoon and get it over with, Meaning, just crank it out, get it over with, and get out of school so you can get on with your life. And to this day, I remember him saying those words like he's standing next to me right now, whispering in my ears. And it was one of those sort of, revelatory moments where you realize it's simple advice and it's absolutely the right thing. There was no reason for me to push so hard back against the system. He said, just do the damn project. Get it over with, graduate, get out, come work for me, and we'll see what happens. Mm-hmm. And so, thank you, Peter Eisman. Ooh, I mean after retirement.
Yes.
Next is a faculty meeting, but in the broader sense, what's next? Well, yeah, good question. Honestly, I haven't thought a lot about that because I'm really more preoccupied with what's going on at the moment, both here at the school and in my own life and so on. And I'm waiting for the final bell, at convocation, I guess it is. That'll be my last convocation, my last commencement. And then I'll step out into the sun and see what happens. Travel is certainly on my itinerary. I'm an inveterate traveler. I can't see enough of the world. So I want to go to Africa. I've been to Morocco, but that's the only time I've stepped foot on the continent. So these two guys are in Rwanda, and I want to visit them and see how they're doing. So my son and I are planning a trip to Rwanda, and then we're going to go up into the mountains to visit with the gorillas. You can go hang out with gorillas. Mm-hmm. And I desperately want to do that. I mean, the idea of coming into contact with raw nature in such close proximity with these magnificent creatures is something that has a great deal of appeal to me. So traveling is one of the things I definitely want to do. I have more writing. I want to finish the damn book, which has been dragging on for a couple of years now. So I'm going to get that done over the summer. I have more writing that I want to do. I want to go diving on the Great Barrier Reef before it disappears. I used to, this is another story, but when I was out of high school and trying to get into day school, I had all sorts of odd jobs, And one of them was as a salvage diver, a scuba diver. I had a business actually for about 3 years that I did that. And it was taking a hobby and turning it into business, and it spoiled it for me for a while. So I stopped doing it. Although it paid very well, I got paid $50 an hour I was working for tugboat companies. I'd go underneath. It was cheaper for them to hire me to go under and inspect the boat rather than to take the boat out of the water. So it was good money, but I gave it up because I didn't like diving in the East River all the time. It was pretty disgusting. So after that, the only diving I did was in tropical waters, on reefs and so in the Caribbean and so forth. And so I definitely want to go back to doing that. And then build more birdhouses. That'll be, something that I'll keep coming back to it as I have time and opportunity. And I have to finish that house up north. If I don't, my wife's gonna kill me.